September 14th, 1839, Lexington County, South Carolina. A plantation mistress walks across dew-soaked grass toward her husband's private barn, drawn by sounds that don't belong to livestock. She pushes open the heavy door. What she discovers there, her distinguished military husband with 5 enslaved women in various states of undress and restraint, should have been a scandal that ended his career. Instead, what happened next would reveal something far more disturbing about the nature of power, complicity, and cruelty in antebellum America. The question isn't what she did when she found them. The question is, why did an entire county gather to watch her do it? This isn't a story about adultery or betrayal. This is about a woman who discovered her husband's systematic sexual violence and torture chamber and chose not to expose him, but to join him. What unfolded in the weeks after that September morning would demonstrate that sometimes the most dangerous perpetrator isn't the one committing the original crime, but the one who transforms private horror into public spectacle while society applauds. Before we continue into one of the darkest chapters of American history, subscribe to this channel and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you want access to exclusive uncensored videos about the world's most brutal crimes and hidden historical atrocities, consider becoming a member. And don't forget to hit the like button. Picture South Carolina in 1839. Cotton is king, and the entire economy rests on the backs of over 300,000 enslaved people who outnumber white residents nearly 2 to 1. This demographic reality creates a permanent state of paranoia among the planter class. They live in constant fear of rebellion, of uprising, of the very people they brutalize rising up to claim justice. In Lexington County, massive plantations stretch for thousands of acres, white columned houses rising like temples to wealth built on human suffering. The air smells of tobacco, fresh-turned earth, and the rot of a system that treats human beings as livestock. You have to understand, this world operates on a social contract of silence. Everyone knows what happens in the slave quarters after dark. Everyone knows about the light-skinned children who appear with features suspiciously similar to the masters. Everyone knows about the screams that sometimes carry across the fields at night, but no one speaks of it. To be respectable in this society means mastering the art of not seeing what's right in front of you. The churches preach about Christian duty while enslaved people sit in segregated balconies. The newspapers print romantic poetry about Southern honor while advertisements for runaway slaves describe scars from whippings in clinical detail. This is the world where our story unfolds, a world where monstrosity wears a gentleman's coat and evil hides behind lace curtains. Colonel Marcus Whitfield stands as a pillar of Lexington County society. At 47 years old, he cuts an impressive figure, tall, silver-haired, with a military bearing that commands immediate respect. He served with distinction in the Seminole Wars, and his plantation, Whitfield Manor, spans over 3,000 acres of prime cotton land. He owns 63 enslaved people, making him one of the wealthier planters in the region. He serves on the county council, reads extensively from his well-stocked library, and can quote both scripture and Shakespeare with equal fluency. Neighbors describe him as refined, educated, a true Southern gentleman. His wife, Catherine Whitfield, age 39, appears to be everything a plantation mistress should be. She manages the household with efficiency, oversees the domestic slaves, arranges elaborate dinner parties where visiting politicians and businessmen are entertained. She's known for her charitable work with the church, her exquisite needlework, and her ability to maintain decorum in all situations. She dresses impeccably in the latest fashions from Charleston, her dark hair always perfectly arranged, her posture rigid with the bearing of someone trained from childhood to never show weakness or impropriety. Visitors to Whitfield Manor consistently praise the couple as models of Southern civility and grace. But here's what you need to understand about people like the Whitfields. The more perfect the public facade, the darker the private reality. They didn't just participate in the evil of slavery. They refined it into something far more personal and sadistic. The barn where Colonel Whitfield spent his private hours had a perfectly reasonable explanation. He told neighbors and visitors that he was conducting agricultural experiments, selective breeding programs for his livestock, testing new strains of cotton, developing improved farming techniques. The barn was off limits to casual visitors, but this seemed entirely appropriate. After all, a man of science and progress needed privacy for his work. He even published occasional letters in agricultural journals discussing crop rotation and soil management, burnishing his reputation as an innovative planter committed to modernizing Southern farming. When enslaved women were seen going to and from the barn, there was an explanation for that too. They were helping with his experiments, of course, grinding feed, carrying water, cleaning equipment. The fact that certain women were specifically assigned to this duty, that they spent hours at a time there, that some of them seemed to walk differently afterward or developed a haunted look in their eyes. Well, farm work was hard labor, wasn't it? Everyone knew that. Catherine Whitfield maintained her own cover story. She was often heard praising her husband's dedication to agricultural improvement, hosting gatherings where he would discuss his theories with other planters. She personally selected which enslaved women would work in the barn, a detail that seemed like simple household management at the time. After all, a wife overseeing her husband's laborers was perfectly normal. The system was so perfectly constructed that even people who suspected something was wrong had no framework to articulate what exactly they were suspecting. Let's be real, that barn was never about agriculture. The building itself had been specially modified over the course of several years. From the outside, it looked like any other large plantation outbuilding: weathered wood, a shingled roof, double doors wide enough to accommodate wagons. But inside, Colonel Whitfield had created something else entirely. The main floor had been divided into sections using heavy curtains that could be drawn or pulled back. Along the walls, iron rings had been bolted into the wooden beams, officially for tying livestock, actually for restraining human beings. In one corner, a collection of items hidden beneath a tarp: chains, leather straps, implements that had no agricultural purpose whatsoever. A small room at the back had been fitted with a lock on the outside. What kind of storage room locks from the outside? The barn had two entrances, the main double doors visible from the house, and a smaller side entrance hidden by overgrown shrubs, allowing discreet comings and goings. Most tellingly, the barn sat far enough from the main house and slave quarters that sounds wouldn't easily carry, but close enough that the colonel could visit multiple times a day without arousing suspicion. Colonel Whitfield had also established a rotation system, documented in his private ledgers, that listed enslaved people by number rather than name. Certain numbers appeared repeatedly next to barn duty with timestamps. This wasn't spontaneous violence. This was organized, methodical, systematic. And that systematic nature is precisely what makes it so chilling. This was a man who approached sexual violence and torture with the same careful planning he applied to his military campaigns. When questions did arise, and they did occasionally, there were always answers. Why did some of the enslaved women assigned to barn duty sometimes show up to their other work with visible injuries? Farm accidents, of course. Livestock could be unpredictable. Equipment was dangerous. There were 1,000 ways to get hurt working on a plantation. Why were these women sometimes seen crying or appearing traumatized? Well, they were slaves, weren't they? Naturally, they were distressed about their condition. Their emotional state was proof of nothing except their station in life. Why did the colonel spend so much time in that barn, often late into the evening? He was a dedicated innovator, that's why. A man of his intelligence and curiosity couldn't be expected to keep regular hours when inspiration struck. Why did he specifically request certain women and send others away? Different tasks required different skills. Some were better with animals. Some were stronger for heavy lifting. Some were more trustworthy with delicate equipment. Plantation management was complex. Such decisions were purely practical. And if some of those women tried to speak about what happened in that barn, well, everyone knew that slaves were prone to lying, especially when they wanted to avoid work or cause trouble for their masters. The law itself was structured to ensure their testimony meant nothing. Enslaved people couldn't testify against white people in court. The system had been designed from top to bottom to make certain crimes invisible. Even when evidence was right in front of people's faces, the law and social custom provided ready-made explanations that allowed everyone to look away. Here's where the story gets even darker. Remember how Catherine Whitfield personally selected which enslaved women worked in the barn? That wasn't coincidental. Meet Elias Crawford, the plantation's overseer, a hard-eyed man of 35 who had worked at Whitfield Manor for 7 years. Crawford's official job was managing the field workers, but his actual role was far more sinister. He served as the colonel's facilitator, the man who made sure everything ran smoothly. Crawford maintained a separate set of records, hidden books that tracked which women went to the barn, when, and for how long. He enforced a code of absolute silence among the enslaved population through a system of escalating punishments. If anyone spoke about what happened in the barn, even to each other, Crawford would know. He had informants within the slave quarters, people so desperate or so broken that they would betray their own for small privileges or to avoid punishment. Crawford also handled the logistics of disposing of evidence. When women became pregnant from the colonel's assaults, Crawford arranged for them to be quietly sold to distant plantations before their condition became too obvious. When injuries were severe enough to attract attention, Crawford provided the cover stories and intimidated witnesses. He was paid exceptionally well for his discretion, twice the normal overseer's salary, and he understood that his own prosperity was tied to maintaining the colonel's secrets. But here's the crucial detail that didn't emerge until much later. Crawford was also Catherine's informant. He reported to her regularly about her husband's activities. She knew everything, and she was planning something. Now I want you to picture 5 specific women, because they deserve to be remembered as people, not statistics. Mary, age 23, had been born on the plantation and worked as a house servant before being reassigned to barn duty. She had a daughter, age 4, who still lived in the slave quarters. Dinah, age 19, had been purchased at auction just 2 years earlier, separated from her family in Virginia. She'd been told she would work in the fields, but that changed quickly. Ruth, age 27, was one of the strongest workers on the plantation, which made her assignment to the barn all the more suspicious. Physical strength meant nothing when you were chained. Bessie, age 16, was the youngest, recently transitioned from child labor to adult work assignments. And Sarah, age 31, had previously worked as a midwife in the slave quarters, a position of respect and relative autonomy. All 5 shared certain characteristics that made them vulnerable. They were all relatively isolated, either separated from family or with family that could be threatened to ensure their silence. They were all considered physically attractive by the standards of the time, a factor that made them targets. They were all strong enough to endure repeated physical trauma without dying immediately, which meant they could be exploited over time. And most significantly, they had all tried in various small ways to resist, refusing orders, attempting to run away, speaking out, and their assignment to barn duty was their punishment. The colonel chose women who needed to be broken, and the barn was where he broke them. Enter Thomas Brennan, age 52, an Irish immigrant who worked as an itinerant carpenter and handyman, traveling between plantations taking whatever work he could find. In early September 1839, Brennan was hired by Colonel Whitfield to repair some damaged roof sections on various outbuildings, including the infamous barn. He arrived early one morning, while the colonel was still in the main house. Brennan climbed up to inspect the barn's roof and noticed something immediately strange. The sounds coming from inside didn't match any agricultural activity he'd ever heard. There were voices crying, and then something that made his blood run cold, the distinct sound of chains. Being curious and concerned, Brennan quietly descended and peered through a gap in the barn's wooden siding. What he saw that morning, the colonel with multiple enslaved women, the restraints, the evidence of ongoing torture and assault, so shocked him that he literally staggered backward. He stood outside that barn, his hands shaking, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. You have to understand, Brennan was poor, powerless, a foreigner with no social standing in this community. But he was also a father with daughters of his own, and what he'd seen violated every moral code he held. He made a decision that would nearly cost him his life. He would report what he'd seen to the authorities. He didn't know that in Lexington County in 1839, there was no authority higher than a wealthy plantation owner. And he didn't know that Catherine Whitfield had been watching him from the main house, observing his reaction through her bedroom window. Thomas Brennan went directly to the county magistrate's office in Lexington Town Center, about 8 miles from Whitfield Manor. He was breathless, agitated, insisting on speaking to someone immediately about a serious crime. The magistrate, Judge Cornelius Shaw, listened to his account with an expression that shifted from interest to skepticism to something like pity. When Brennan finished describing what he'd seen, Judge Shaw leaned back in his chair and asked a simple question. Do you have any idea who you're accusing? Brennan did not at that moment understand the full implications of accusing a prominent colonel and county council member. Judge Shaw explained with patronizing patience that Colonel Whitfield was a respected gentleman, a war hero, a man of impeccable character. Whatever Brennan thought he saw, he must have misunderstood. Perhaps the enslaved women were being punished for some infraction. Plantation discipline was the master's prerogative after all. Perhaps they were being treated for illness. Perhaps Brennan, being new to the area, didn't understand how things worked in the South. The judge suggested strongly that Brennan should collect his pay from the colonel, complete his work quickly, and keep his wild accusations to himself. Spreading such rumors could be considered slander, and slander was a serious offense. Brennan left that office shaking with frustration and fear. That night, As he stayed in a boarding house in town, two men broke into his room. They didn't kill him. That would have raised questions, but they beat him severely and delivered a clear message: leave Lexington County immediately and never speak of what he saw again. Brennan departed the next morning, bruised and terrified, his faith in justice shattered. Here's where it gets interesting. Judge Shaw did exactly what he was expected to do. He visited Whitfield Manor the next day, not to investigate, but to warn the colonel that an unfortunate rumor had surfaced. This wasn't a criminal inquiry. It was a courtesy call between gentlemen. The colonel and Catherine received him in their elegant parlor, serving imported tea while discussing the situation with calm detachment. Marcus Whitfield expressed appropriate outrage at the carpenter's accusations, explaining that he'd been conducting a routine inspection of some of the female slaves that morning, checking for signs of disease that might spread to the rest of his workforce. The chains Brennan claimed to hear? Absurd. The distress he claimed to witness? Perhaps the women were being scolded for laziness or theft. Surely even an Irishman understood that discipline was sometimes necessary. Catherine sat beside her husband, nodding agreement, her face a mask of sympathetic concern for her husband's unfairly tarnished reputation. Judge Shaw accepted their explanations completely and apologized for the necessity of even asking such questions. He assured them the matter was closed. But the matter wasn't closed, not really. Word had spread among the enslaved population that someone had tried to report what was happening. For a brief moment, there had been hope that the outside world might intervene. When nothing happened, when the colonel continued his activities unchanged, that hope died. And something else died with it: the belief that anyone in power cared what happened to them. The message was clear: there was no help coming. There was no one who would stop this. This is where the story gets truly chilling. In the 2 weeks following Thomas Brennan's failed report, something changed in the 5 women who regularly worked in the barn. Other enslaved people noticed it immediately. Mary, who had always sung while she worked, went silent. Her 4-year-old daughter would run to her for comfort, and Mary would stare at the child as if she couldn't quite remember who she was. Dinah developed a nervous tremor in her hands that never went away. She started pulling out her own hair during the night, unconsciously, until bald patches appeared on her scalp. Ruth, the strong one, began moving like someone much older, her shoulders permanently hunched, her gaze fixed on the ground. She would flinch violently at sudden movements, even from people she'd known for years. Bessie, the youngest, stopped eating almost entirely. Her body began wasting away, her eyes developing that hollow look that comes from complete dissociation from reality. And Sarah, the former midwife who had once been a source of strength and knowledge in the community, started having violent episodes, screaming fits where she would claw at her own skin, leaving bloody marks. These weren't just emotional responses to trauma. These women had been systematically broken, their spirits deliberately crushed. And everyone could see it. The transformation was so dramatic, so visible, that it became impossible to deny that something horrific was happening. But seeing isn't the same as acting. The other enslaved people were helpless to intervene, bound by their own captivity and fear. Now you have to understand the full scope of what Colonel Whitfield had created. This wasn't random violence. It was a carefully designed system of control and degradation. Later evidence would reveal that the colonel kept detailed journals describing his activities with the clinical detachment of a scientist documenting experiments. He wrote about different methods of inflicting pain while minimizing visible marks. He documented how long it took to break someone's will through various combinations of physical torture, sexual assault, and psychological manipulation. He tested how much trauma a person could endure before they became useless for his purposes. He even developed a ranking system, rating his victims on their reactions, their resistance levels, their breaking points. The journals described isolation techniques, keeping women separate from each other so they couldn't find solidarity. Sleep deprivation tactics, forcing them to work in the barn during hours they would normally rest. Dietary manipulation, controlling their food to weaken them physically while maintaining just enough strength for them to endure his violence. He wrote about the psychology of terror, how anticipation of pain was often more effective than pain itself. The barn had become his laboratory, and enslaved women were his subjects. This level of methodical cruelty reveals something crucial. Marcus Whitfield wasn't acting on impulse or passion. He was engaged in deliberate, sustained torture that he found intellectually stimulating. He was a sadist, who had found the perfect system, slavery, that allowed him to indulge his worst impulses with complete legal protection and social approval. But this story doesn't end with unchallenged evil, because even in the darkest places resistance emerges. Meet Samuel Parker, age 34, an enslaved blacksmith who worked on a neighboring plantation but was frequently hired out to other properties, including Whitfield Manor. Parker was unusual in several ways. He'd been taught to read by a previous owner's daughter before that practice was made illegal. He was physically imposing, over 6 feet tall, powerfully built from years of smithing work, which gave him a degree of protection that most enslaved people didn't have. Masters were less likely to casually brutalize someone who could physically resist, even though any actual resistance would mean death. But most importantly, Parker had maintained something rare and dangerous: hope. He was part of an underground network of enslaved people who shared information between plantations, who helped runaways, who kept alive the possibility that life could be different. He'd been planning his own escape for years, carefully saving money from tips he occasionally received, mapping routes north, building connections. But when he came to Whitfield Manor to repair tools in early September and saw the condition of the 5 women, something changed in his calculations. He learned what had happened from the other enslaved people there, about the barn, about the colonel's torture chamber, about how a white man had tried to report it and been driven away. And Samuel Parker made a decision that would alter not just his life, but the lives of everyone at Whitfield Manor. He would gather evidence so undeniable that even a corrupt system couldn't ignore it. Samuel Parker's plan was dangerous and required patience he didn't know if he possessed. He convinced his master to hire him out to Whitfield Manor for an extended period. There was always metalwork needed on a large plantation. This gave him access and time to observe. He began by gaining the trust of the enslaved community there, which wasn't easy. They'd been betrayed before, learned to trust no one. But Parker was patient, offering help where he could, listening more than he spoke, proving through small actions that he was someone who could be relied upon. Slowly, people began talking to him. The women who worked in the barn were too traumatized to speak much, but others who'd witnessed events shared what they knew. Parker learned about the rotation system, about Overseer Crawford's role, about the hidden ledgers. He learned that Catherine Whitfield wasn't ignorant of her husband's crimes. She was actively involved in selecting victims and maintaining the system. Most crucially, he learned something no one else knew. There was a witness to the violence, someone who had actually seen inside the barn during one of the colonel's sessions. Not Thomas Brennan, the carpenter who'd fled, someone else who'd been too terrified to come forward. A young enslaved boy named Job, age 12, who'd been sent to fetch water and had peered through a crack in the barn wall. Job could identify what he'd seen, describe it in detail. He could testify if there was ever a venue that would listen to a child's testimony. Parker knew that testimony alone wouldn't be enough. The word of enslaved people meant nothing in court. He needed physical evidence. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling. Before we continue, I need you to understand something. What Samuel Parker was about to attempt could have resulted in his death, and not a quick death either. Enslaved people caught spying on white families, especially wealthy ones, could be executed in ways designed to terrify others into submission. Public torture, dismemberment, burning, these weren't hypothetical threats. They happened. And Parker knew this. He knew the risks. But he also knew that if he did nothing, the horror would continue indefinitely, and more women would be destroyed. So he made a choice. Hit the like button if you believe some acts of courage are worth any risk. Drop a comment about whether you could have made Parker's choice. And stay with me, because what he discovered in that barn would lead to one of the most shocking public confrontations in antebellum Southern history. On September 28, 1839, Samuel Parker did something that should have gotten him killed. The colonel was away visiting Charleston on business, which meant the barn was theoretically empty. Parker waited until after midnight, then carefully made his way across the dark plantation grounds. He'd stolen a key to the barn's padlock from Crawford's office, a risk that alone could have cost him his hand if discovered. The barn door swung open silently. Parker had oiled the hinges earlier that day during his regular work. Inside, using only the faint moonlight coming through gaps in the walls, he began to search. And he found everything. The iron rings bolted to walls, the chains and restraints, some still stained with blood. The implements of torture, including devices clearly designed for sexual assault. But what Parker was looking for specifically was documentary evidence, and he found it in a locked chest in the back room. The chest wasn't difficult to break open for a skilled blacksmith. Inside, Colonel Whitfield's journals, 3 leather-bound books filled with his meticulous handwriting, describing in horrific detail what he'd done to dozens of women over the course of 7 years. Dates, names, methods, observations. It was all there, written in the colonel's own hand, a confession so complete and damning that no amount of social standing could explain it away. Parker stood in that dark barn, holding those journals, knowing he possessed evidence that could finally bring justice. But he also knew that getting this evidence to someone who would act on it was going to be nearly impossible, and that's when he heard the footsteps outside. The barn door burst open. Overseer Crawford stood silhouetted against the moonlight, holding a pistol. "I knew someone was passing information," Crawford said, his voice eerily calm. "Figured it was you, blacksmith. Too smart for your own good." Parker had a split second to make a decision. He couldn't fight. Crawford had a gun, and any violence against a white man meant certain death. He couldn't surrender. Crawford would kill him anyway quietly and dispose of the body. So he ran. Parker crashed through the back window of the barn, glass shattering around him, still clutching those journals. He heard the gunshot, felt the bullet whip past his head as he sprinted across the dark field. Behind him, Crawford was shouting, raising the alarm. Dogs began barking. More men emerged from the overseer's house. Parker ran toward the only place that might offer sanctuary, the neighboring plantation owned by a man named Harrison, who was known to be somewhat less brutal than most masters, and more importantly, who had a long-standing property dispute with Colonel Whitfield. If Parker could reach Harrison's land, there might be a chance. He ran through cotton fields, crashing through the plants, his powerful legs driving him forward. The dogs were getting closer. He could hear them baying behind him. Parker reached a creek and plunged in, hoping the water would confuse his scent. He waded downstream for a quarter-mile before climbing out on the far bank, his lungs burning, still gripping those journals like his life depended on them. Because it did. Samuel Parker collapsed on the porch of Harrison's plantation house just before dawn, bloody and exhausted. He'd made it. Harrison himself came to the door, and Parker thrust the journals toward him, gasping out an explanation. Evidence of crimes at Whitfield Manor, torture, systematic rape, everything documented. Harrison took the journals, flipped through them, his expression darkening as he read. But then something unexpected happened. Harrison looked at Parker and said, "This is quite a problem you've brought to my doorstep." Parker, still catching his breath, didn't understand. Here was proof, undeniable written evidence. But Harrison's next words shattered everything. "You've stolen property from Colonel Whitfield. These journals belong to him, and you, Parker, belong to someone else entirely. You're a runaway slave on my property with stolen goods. Let's be real." Parker had made a fatal miscalculation. He'd assumed that evidence of crime so horrific would transcend the social order. He hadn't understood that to men like Harrison, the sanctity of property rights, including the right to own human beings and do with them as you pleased, was more fundamental than any concept of justice. Harrison sent word to Whitfield Manor that he had recovered stolen property and captured a runaway. When Colonel Whitfield arrived later that morning to collect his property, he thanked Harrison profusely. The journals were returned. Samuel Parker was chained and dragged away. From Parker's perspective, justice had proven to be nothing more than another tool of oppression. The evidence existed, had been seen by another white man of standing, and it changed nothing. But here's what Samuel Parker didn't know. Harrison had kept one of the journals. Not out of moral conscience, let's be clear about that, but because he saw an opportunity to destroy a business rival. Harrison and Whitfield had been locked in legal disputes over land boundaries for years. This was leverage. Harrison brought the journal to a coalition of other planters who also had grudges against the colonel, framing it not as a moral issue, but as a matter of Whitfield becoming a liability. "If this becomes public scandal," Harrison argued, "it affects all of us. Makes people up north even more agitated about slavery. We need to handle this quietly, internally." The coalition agreed. On October 15, 1839, a group of planters and local authorities conducted a private inspection of Whitfield Manor. Not a raid in the legal sense, but a visit that Whitfield couldn't refuse without admitting guilt. What they found in that barn exceeded even their expectations. The torture implements, the restraints, the bloodstains that no amount of cleaning had completely removed. The tools designed specifically for sexual torture. The separate room where women were kept isolated for days. They found documentation of more than 50 women who had been victimized over 7 years, some of whom had subsequently died from their injuries or been sold away when they became pregnant. They found evidence of at least 3 cases where women had been murdered when they became too damaged to be useful. The barn was a chamber of horrors that made even hardened slaveholders uncomfortable, not because they opposed slavery, but because Whitfield's excesses threatened to draw unwanted attention to the entire system. This is where Catherine Whitfield steps back into the story, and where everything gets even darker. Remember how she discovered her husband in the barn that September morning? The coalition of planters during their investigation demanded to interview her separately, and Catherine did something unexpected. She cooperated fully. She revealed that she'd known about her husband's activities for years, since shortly after their marriage in 1828. She described how she'd initially been horrified, had confronted him, had threatened to expose him. Marcus's response had been to explain the reality of her situation. She had no money of her own, no family who would take her back if she left her marriage, no legal standing to testify against her husband, and no social position if she became a divorced woman. She was trapped. But Catherine's story didn't end with helplessness. Over the years, something had changed in her. She'd stopped trying to save the enslaved women and had started participating in their exploitation. She selected victims based on her own criteria, women she perceived as too attractive, too proud, too resistant to her authority as mistress of the house. She viewed barn duty as punishment for enslaved women who displeased her. She'd become complicit not through ignorance, but through a calculated decision that if she couldn't escape the system, she would gain power within it. The investigators learned that Catherine had been planning something for months, a public demonstration that would solidify her control of the plantation after her husband's inevitable downfall. She'd been gathering evidence against Marcus not to save his victims, but to destroy him and claim his property for herself. As the investigation deepened, another horrifying dimension emerged. Colonel Whitfield hadn't been acting in isolation. The coalition discovered correspondence with other plantation owners across South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana, men who shared his particular sadistic interests. They had created an informal network, exchanging letters describing their methods, sometimes even trading enslaved women between properties when they became too traumatized to be useful locally. The journals referenced visits from other planters who came to Whitfield Manor specifically to participate in the torture sessions. Names began emerging: prominent men, respected citizens, people who would later be remembered as pillars of their communities. The scope suggested that this wasn't an isolated case of one man's depravity, but a network of sadists who had recognized in slavery the perfect system for indulging their worst impulses without consequence. Letters revealed discussions of creating a more formal organization, a sort of secret society dedicated to perfecting methods of control and torture. They referenced similar operations in the Caribbean and Brazil, where slavery was even less regulated. The international dimension meant this was bigger than one county scandal. It threatened to expose a systematic culture of torture that extended throughout the slave-owning world. This is precisely what terrified the investigating coalition. If this became public, if abolitionists in the North got hold of this information, it would provide ammunition that could threaten the entire institution of slavery. The evidence was too damning, too detailed, too widespread. Something had to be done, but it had to be done quietly, in a way that wouldn't draw national attention. Now, you have to understand what happened next reveals everything about how power protects itself. The coalition of planters made a calculated decision. This scandal would never see daylight. They couldn't allow it to. The evidence was sealed, hidden away in private archives that wouldn't be discovered for over a century. The network of correspondence was destroyed, letters burned, names redacted from the few documents that survived. Why? Because these men understood that protecting the institution of slavery meant protecting even its most monstrous practitioners from public scrutiny. If the North learned that plantation owners were operating torture networks, exchanging victims like livestock, documenting their sadism in meticulous journals, It would ignite a firestorm that might accelerate the movement toward abolition. So they crafted a new narrative. Colonel Whitfield was quietly declared mentally unstable, a tragic case of a war veteran whose mind had been damaged by his service. This framing was crucial. It made him an aberration rather than a symptom of the system. The local newspapers, controlled by the planter class, ran brief notices about the colonel's retirement due to ill health, with no mention of investigations or crimes. Churches that had praised him for years simply stopped mentioning his name, letting him fade from sermons and social gatherings. The enslaved people who could testify? Their silence was ensured through threats, through sales to distant plantations, through the understanding that speaking out meant death. The conspiracy of silence extended through every level of society: legal, religious, social, economic. Everyone who mattered had decided that preserving the appearance of Southern honor was more important than justice for 50 women whose testimony wouldn't be legally valid anyway. Let's talk about what happened to the people in this story, because their fates reveal the true horror of systemic injustice. Colonel Marcus Whitfield was never charged with any crime. Instead, he was quietly committed to a private asylum in Virginia. Not a punishment, but a comfortable retirement funded by his still considerable wealth. He lived there for another 12 years, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1851 at age 59. His obituary in the Charleston newspaper praised his military service and agricultural innovations, making no reference to the torture chamber he'd operated for nearly a decade. Catherine Whitfield got exactly what she'd planned for. With her husband declared incompetent, she gained legal control of Whitfield Manor and all its assets, including the 63 enslaved people. She ran the plantation successfully for another 23 years, becoming known as a shrewd businesswoman. She never remarried, never faced social ostracism, and died wealthy and respected in 1862. Overseer Elias Crawford was quietly dismissed, the only real consequence anyone in power faced. He moved to Alabama and secured another overseer position within months: Samuel Parker, the blacksmith who'd risked everything to expose the truth. He was sold to a brutal cotton plantation in Mississippi as punishment for running away. Records suggest he attempted escape again in 1842 and was killed by slave catchers. His courage bought him nothing but an unmarked grave. Thomas Brennan, the Irish carpenter who first tried to report what he'd seen, left no further trace in historical records. Likely he disappeared into poverty, his faith in American justice destroyed. The 5 women, Mary, Dinah, Ruth, Bessie, and Sarah, their fates are harder to trace because enslaved people's stories were rarely recorded. Fragmentary evidence suggests Mary died in 1841, possibly from complications of injuries sustained in the barn. Dinah appears in later plantation records, but with notations suggesting severe mental instability. Ruth was sold away from Whitfield Manor in 1840. Her subsequent fate is unknown. Bessie died in 1843 at age 20. The death register lists consumption but provides no details. Sarah lived the longest, surviving until after the Civil War, when she gave testimony to Freedmen's Bureau officials about conditions under slavery. Her account, buried in archives for over a century, is one of the few primary sources confirming this story. Here's the moral, and it's uncomfortable: evil doesn't always lose. Sometimes evil retires comfortably to an asylum. Sometimes evil runs a successful plantation for decades. Sometimes evil wears respectability like armor that nothing can penetrate. The Jen tragedy isn't just what happened in that barn, it's what happened afterward. A complete system failure where justice was deliberately prevented, where witnesses were silenced, where evidence was hidden, where perpetrators were protected, because exposing them threatened the larger institution of slavery. This story forces us to confront a disturbing truth. The greatest crimes often aren't punished because the systems that should deliver justice are themselves complicit in the evil. The conspiracy wasn't an aberration. It was the system working exactly as designed. So I want you to ask yourself something. Could this happen today? Could systematic torture operate with full knowledge of surrounding communities, with evidence readily available, and still face no consequences because exposing it threatens powerful institutions? Could courage be punished while evil retires comfortably? Let's be real. We'd like to think we're different now, that we've evolved beyond such failures of justice. But institutions still protect their own. Whistleblowers still face retaliation. Evidence still gets buried when it's inconvenient for powerful people. The mechanisms may be more sophisticated, but the fundamental dynamic, power protecting power, remains unchanged. Drop a comment telling us, what modern institution would you trust to actually pursue justice if it meant exposing their own complicity? Subscribe to this channel because we're committed to uncovering the stories that comfortable histories prefer to forget. Share this video because these 50 women deserve to be remembered, and Samuel Parker's courage deserves to be honored, even though it bought him nothing but death. Hit the like button if you believe that naming historical evil, even when justice failed, serves a purpose. And brace yourself for our next investigation because we're going deeper into antebellum horror. The story of a respected physician who ran a surgical experimentation facility disguised as a hospital for enslaved people, where anesthesia was considered unnecessary, consent was impossible, and medical advancement was built on screaming bodies. That story drops next week. Until then, remember, the past isn't past. It's still teaching us who we are.